Welcome to On the Soul's Terms podcast, a weaving of astrology, Greek mythology, and depth psychology. I'm Chris Skidmore, an astrologer, psychotherapist, and craniosacral therapist living in Ubud, Bali. Hello and welcome to the show. And today we'll be following on from last week's episode, which was my interview with Brice Hancock. Brice runs a recovery center in Denver, Colorado, and it's a safe housing center for people recovering from addiction and addictive processes. It was fascinating to talk with Brice and to get his perspective and to hear what it's like to be a recovering addict. And I found so many questions were bubbling up from that interview that had been bubbling up for quite a while. I think addiction is a really fascinating topic, one that I think can be elaborated on through the use of mythology and astrology. So what I'm hoping to do in this episode is to take in what Brice was talking about and take in all of the benefits of AA, take in all of the structures that help us get well and recover and find our way back to a healthy and structured life again from addictive processes. But for this episode, we're going to go a little bit off-piste and we're going to find our way through a conversation around the myth of the sirens in Greek mythology, and also talking a little bit about Saturn and Neptune, who are both in Pisces right now. Before I get into all of this, I just want to say, and acknowledge that addiction is an extraordinarily complex topic. There's many factors and there's really no one-size-fits-all solution for addiction. I just want to acknowledge that and acknowledge there's many paths, and AA is one path, and it's got an extraordinary value for so many people. And if you are yourself moving through or in the throes of an addictive process, or I really encourage you to reach out for professional support, get help. That's one of the things that actually comes up in the mythology. Nobody's doing it alone out there, not even the great heroes. And as you go through this episode, I'd really encourage reflection, because, we all have some level of addictive process that goes on in our lives. So I really invite you to drop into the themes of the episode, drop into what is there for you in your own processes, and maybe those of, some people that you love that have been in and out of these places. Finally, I would say that recovery from addiction is a personal journey and process, and just encourage those out there to find that strength and resilience and abilities to move through it and to move into a more healthy and whole life. And my hope for this episode is it'll take us into that space for those of us who are drawn to more creative ways of working through things like working through a story or working through a myth and finding our ways into the myth. I just really invite you to find places in this myth that can help you to both in the Saturnian way stabilize yourself and find your way back to your central column and everything involved in that, whilst also holding open the space for the Neptunian, which is the more intuitive feeling center and some kind of a transcendent experience of what it is to be a human being, some kind of a spiritual or soulful experience. So yes, I'll just have a quick look before we get into the mythic stuff of what's going on. So I'll be releasing this podcast on November 8th. That'll be at 6 a.m. Sydney time in Australia. At that time, the sun is at 15 degrees of Scorpio. So that's an interesting one in itself. Scorpio is a sign that does take us through the underworld. And I specifically use that word through the underworld because we have to remember to keep moving when we are in those underworld processes. Maybe that's why it's Hermes with the winged sandals and the winged helmet who gets to move down there and back because of his ability to keep moving. And we know that Scorpio is a fixed water sign, so there's often some kind of a traumatic experience we're trying to get through. If you think about the Scorpio myth of Medusa, or the myth of Medusa that I relate to Scorpio, I should probably say, she's frozen there in space and time, and everybody that she looks at, if she catches their eyes, they also freeze. So it can be that kind of a process. And 15 degrees of Scorpio certainly takes us right into the middle, into the heart of the matter, the apex of Scorpio. Of course, that's not all that Scorpio is, and I'm certainly not saying that. But if I was going to place addiction in the zodiac, I would put it in the signs, I would say, of Pisces and Scorpio, two of the water signs that can be like a swamping of the unconscious. Also in the sky right now is the opposition between Mars, who is at just 1 degree of Leo. So we have a very heroic Mars that is looking to have courage. And as we know, courage means to come from the heart, at 1 degree of Leo. And that is really a close opposition between that and Pluto, which is now at 29 degrees and 48 minutes of Capricorn, getting very, very close now to that November 20, where Pluto heads into Aquarius and stays there for the next 20 odd years. These are the two rulers of Scorpio, and they happen to be, one is at 1 degree of Leo and the other is at 29 degrees of Capricorn. So you can feel the tension of opposition between those two, even though they're off sign. It's an off sign opposition. And I think you'll see that as we get into the Siren story of this heroic quest that it can be to make it into the underworld and back, and what that really takes. And the only other thing that I'll reference on this chart really, although there's always so much else going on, is that Saturn is now really slowing down. It's been retrograde and it's slowing down, and it is at 12 degrees of Pisces, slowing down, going backwards. It's stationing, and then on November 17th, it will station direct, and then it will start going direct again. So that is at 12 degrees of Pisces. If you know your chart and you have anything in your chart that is at around that 10 to 14 degrees of a mutable sign, that will be very much being affected at the moment by that Saturn. And that's also quite a nice image, if you take that in, of Saturn trying to make boundaries and limits, trying to get us anchored into reality, but it's in that sign of Pisces, which you just get the feeling it struggles inside of Pisces, because Pisces is typically, as it is, ruled by Neptune, which is also in Pisces right now, gives it that sense of dissolving of boundaries. And I bring these two in because they really are the two planets that I think are very much involved in this process of addiction and recovery. AA, in my mind, it puts in these 12 steps, which is quite an astrological number actually. But it puts these 12 steps in, and it's very, very focused, and you've got accountability, and you have to follow the steps and really do it right and make sure you go through it. It's a really sobering experience, and sobriety is Saturn's realm, whereas Neptune is the other world. It's access to otherworldly experiences. That's why it rules spirituality and transcendent states, but it can also rule illusion, confusion, delusion. They don't end up getting you stuck in this fantasy realm where you can't seem to make head nor tail of things and don't know what's up or what's down. It's an image, isn't it, where we've got Saturn attempting to make these boundaries, but it's in Pisces, which is attempting to dissolve these boundaries. And so there's the tensional point that we find alive in the chart right now. So, if you're going through these kinds of experiences, if you're in those kinds of states, then planets are with you, and hopefully they're with you as a guide and as a helper. And ultimately, I think with both Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, and they will be having their conjunction in 2025. Both as they move into Aries. So they're building up that kind of unconscious component, and then eventually they'll come together, those two. And we have to wonder what that looks like. We've got themes of, really ultimately the theme I see there is magic. I see Saturn as being able to create the witch's cauldron, and Neptune being the actual magic that happens in there. But of course it's hard to do that, and sometimes we don't have the right containers and we don't have the right cultural frequencies to help us navigate these things. So let's go into the myth of the sirens. This is what I've been sitting with for a little while now, and we've got two separate stories. One is the story of Odysseus and his crew in the Odyssey, and the second story is with Jason and the Argonauts. Both of these heroes are going on this big quest. Odysseus is in the process of trying to find his way home but he keeps getting turned around, and this is Neptune or Poseidon keeps turning him around and setting him adrift. Sometimes he gets very close to home. In fact, the journey from Troy to Ithaca is just around the corner, but he gets turned around, and it takes him 10 years just to go basically around the block. He gets sent to all sorts of places, and that's the great adventure that becomes the Odyssey from Homer. The other stories from Jason and the Argonauts, that's like your Avengers-style heroes. That's all of the great heroes are all together, and they're also on a great quest. But rather than Odysseus is trying to find his way home, Jason and the Argonauts are trying to find their way to the Golden Fleece, which is in a grove sacred to Mars or Ares, and it's guarded by a dragon. So they're in a very classically heroic journey trying to find that Golden Fleece. There's a lot of images there that speak to the individuation process from a Jungian perspective. And for Odysseus, it's just trying to find your way home. So I wonder if even we just take these two stories. One is trying to find your way home, almost like trying to remember who you are, come back to the essence of what it is to be you or to be human or what it is to be in your situation. That journey home is such a profound image for us. On my adventure in Mendocino with Michael Mead, a lot of the time we were singing songs, African songs, and these songs were just very simple songs of asking the spirits to guide us home. And that's really what it's like for Odysseus as well. It's just that we might have forgotten our songs, and that will come up also later in the episode. So Odysseus is finding his way home. Jason and the Argonauts, however, are on the epic quest, and on that quest for the Golden Fleece. The real gold is often hidden in a cave somewhere and guarded by some kind of monstrous dragon, and we have to come up against that monstrous dragon. And that might be also a good tie-in for our theme for the day. In the first story, we have Odysseus, and he's going through these waters with the sirens, and he knows that they sing a dangerous song. See, sirens are not like, in the modern day, we think of mermaids. We think of the Little Mermaid. We think of these beautiful maidens that are under the sea singing wonderful songs with their lobster friends and really having a good bop along and falling in love with princes, and it all lives happily ever after. Well, that was not the old sirens. In fact, that wasn't even the mermaid of Hans Christian Andersen. If you don't know the story that Hans Christian Andersen wrote, it's pretty brutal for that mermaid. She loses her voice, which is her whole gift, really. And then, although she's given feet as a human, it feels like she's walking on knives. And then the prince makes her dance for him. It's a crazy story, really. It's pretty intense. So that's that mermaid from a much more recent time with Hans Christian Andersen. And if we go back, we see the sirens. And the sirens are, they're mermaid-like creatures. They live in the sea, and they sing their sweet, sweet song to lure the weary sailor to the edge of the boat and then have them jump off the edge of the boat to be with the siren, and that's what takes them to their watery grave. So it's a pretty apt description of what it's like to be in an addictive process. If you were listening to Brice last week, you would have heard, what it was like for him when he was running that bar. He was getting blind drunk, blackout drunk every night. Despite wanting to quit and wanting to get healthy and wanting to get sober, the lure of that bottle just kept bringing him in. And that's very much like the siren. He'd wake up in the morning and the bottle was calling to him, and he didn't really have anything between him and the bottle. So we can hear that as a very, astrologically and archetypally Neptunian process where all of the self is being essentially dissolved into the solvent of alcohol. So knowing that they're going through these waters with the sirens, Odysseus asks his men to tie him to the mast. They put beeswax in their ears and they row under the hull. They can't see and they can't hear the sirens. They just know to row, and they got beeswax in their ears, so they're completely safe from the sirens and their process. And meanwhile, Odysseus doesn't want the beeswax in his ears, but he wants to be tied to the mast, so it's impossible for him to act on it. And that is how they go through. We can see the men down there rowing and rowing with their beeswax in the ears, and on top we have Odysseus, who is tied to the mast, beeswax is out of the ears, he's able to hear, and he's in the temptation, he's in the agony. This is actually quite a Neptunian, as in Dionysian experience, which is the agony and the ecstasy. So he's close to the ecstasy and he wants that ecstasy, but he knows it's going to be his death and his downfall, so he doesn't act on it, but he does want to hear it. Whatever that substance is, or maybe that person, or that activity, or that thing that you do, there's so many things, especially in the modern world, that are addictive. I mean, one thing we could put straight up that I think everybody, because I think the great collective addiction of our time is our phones. How often is that phone just calling, singing its sweet song, offering that dopamine hit, telling you that don't worry, you just go onto Instagram, you go onto YouTube, you go on Facebook, TikTok, whatever you're into, Twitter, and then you can have this really sweet experience, and then you're trying to put it down, but it just keeps calling and just keeps calling, And I think it's the greatest collective addiction, because it's also the kind of addiction that keeps us connected to each other one way or another. So we're always getting messages and notifications and people reaching out to us. So, ultimately we're all participating in a way. And plus there's those algorithms. There's the way that thing actually is designed to be addictive, as we know, even right down to what we do with our thumb and all of that being based on neuroscience. And, this is one use of psychology, right? Some psychology students get out of psychology and go work for marketing divisions. And rather than try to help people out of these awful, nasty situations, they help them into it, which is part of the madness of our current world, is it not? Anyway, so whatever, maybe at this point you can locate your addictive tendency, or whether that's in the past or the present, something that does call to you, and maybe take a moment here just to get a feel for what is your particular siren. To describe it to you, this is my 4-phase process that I've been sitting with for a little while, as I've been looking through all of these myths and finding all of these stories. And phase 1 for your addictive process is the beeswax in the ears and just row. So this is the men under the hull. They've got their oar. The thing about rowing is that you're going backwards, so you don't even really know where you're going. You just know that you're going somewhere. The beeswax cuts out all the noise. You can't see them, you can't hear them, and that's complete avoidance of the substance entirely. So in the case of, say, alcohol, that's complete abstinence. You're not going to touch it anymore. In the case of the phone, you just throw that thing away and get yourself a Nokia or a dumb phone or something like that. It's just like, I'm not going to look at that anymore, and it's completely done for you. So this is that phase 1, right? Now in phase 2, we're like Odysseus. We want to hear it. We want to hear the sound, but we need to make sure we've been tied to the mast. And remember that it's not, Odysseus doesn't tie himself to the mast, because that wouldn't make any sense. If he ties himself to the mast, he'll also know how to untie himself from the mast. So instead he gets his crew to do that for him, and his crew all tie him to the mast, and so it's impossible for him to get out of that. And then you can only imagine he's screaming and making all this noise. But he wants the agony. He wants to be close enough to it. So this is where we're still safe, but we're allowed to be around it. We can sort of like allow this thing to be somewhere in the vicinity, and we'll be okay. In the case of alcohol, that's the ability to go to the bars and go to these places where there is alcohol and trust that you'll just have water, or you'll just have like non-alcoholic things. That's kind of phase 1, phase 2. And then when I found Jason and the Argonauts, it really opened up my imagination to what else might be possible. When I was learning in psychotherapy at the school I learned, which is called Metavision, we were doing some work on the addictive process. And part of the Jungian perspective around addiction is like that there's something in the addictive substance that is calling to you that is actually good for you on the other side of it, but the substance itself is the thing that's killing you. Jung sort of asks, what are we really reaching out for? That's what his main point was in his letter to Bill W., which was entitled Spiritus Contra Spiritum. It's like the spirit in place of the spirit, a little play on words when it comes to the spirit in alcohol and the spirit of the soul, or the spirit of the self. And so when we're reaching out, what are we really reaching for? In a lot of cases, we're reaching for that element of ourselves that is in the shadow or further away from the identification that we have for the self. We're reaching for that thing. It's just that while we're reaching for it, in the way we pick up the bottle, or in the way we pick up the phone, or in the way we pick up the person or the other substance, the drug, the benzos, the morphine, the whatever it is, all sorts of things in this world can be a siren. The question would be then, what are we truly reaching for? And what is it in Odysseus that thinks that he needs to, rather than just kind of also put beeswax in his ears and also row? Why does this hero want the beeswax out of the ears? Why does he want to be able to hear these sirens, but also have some assurance that he's tied to the mast? In this sense, like astrologically right now, we have that Mars in Leo, this bold hero who's going through the dangerous waters. That would be Pluto at the final degree of Capricorn, and the Capricorn component there ruled by Saturn of being tied up so you can't act on it. So oftentimes, we think about this, it's a boat full of men, but they're going through water. So one simple way of looking at that is like the feeling function, or the element of emotion, or, less logical processes, or the imagination is somewhere there in the water. And maybe as heroes, they've turned off that component of their consciousness. They've exiled that, or they've projected that onto women in their life, or whatever it might be, where they're not the ones that feel. Someone else has to do the feeling. And so then that's an invitation as far as an inferior function, where the feeling function becomes an inferior function, and maybe the thinking function, which is opposite feeling in the Jungian sense, is strong. That's a superior function. So everything has to come back to thinking or philosophizing, and nothing comes back to the feeling. So that's why maybe the waters become monstrous. Not because water is monstrous, water is far from monstrous, but if it gets exiled, then you can imagine that it would be, in fact, coming up as a monstrous element. So now we're going to leave Odysseus behind. Goodbye, Odysseus. Goodbye, the crew. And they can't hear us, but we're going to say it anyway. And we're going to head away from them. And we're going to go to Jason and the Argonauts. And we're going to go through the same waters, but with Jason and the Argonauts. Now, Jason has assembled a set of heroes, as I said, much like the modern day Avengers. So you've got all the greatest heroes. Hercules is there, and, Jason and Castor and Pollux, and all of these great heroes. Most of the ones that you can think of in ancient Greece are on board. But also with them is a less heroic but very well recognized figure, Orpheus. So Orpheus is the music god. And it always was very curious to me of like what Orpheus is even doing there amongst these heroes, because as we know from his story with Eurydice, he's the god who is really poetic, musical, soulful. He's not really involved in hero stuff. I mean, the big hero thing he did was to go down to the underworld to attempt to bring back his love and sing beautiful songs, come down to this, bring the all of nature down to this state of reflection and contemplation with his song. It's heroic in the sense of it's an ability to go to the underworld and come back, but it's not heroic in the sense of kind of classical heroicism like Jason and the Argonauts, where they're seeking out the golden fleece. They are basically just going for it out in the world to go on the great hero quest. So what's he doing there? And then you realize that, well, when they go through those same waters, which are the waters of the sirens, these heroes take a different approach. Nobody's tied up. Nobody has beeswax in their ears at all. Rather than any of that kind of thing, Orpheus plays his music on board. And the instruction to the heroes is attune to the sounds of Orpheus and tune out the sirens. So this is a very different, more nuanced approach, right? Like there's an understanding that addictive thing is around, but Orpheus here to me represents the sound of the soul, or even the sound of the spirit, or even the sound of the self, where if you're able to really know your own sound, like your hum, like your deep inner sound, if you're able to know that sound, then you can attune to that sound. And this is the image. Orpheus is playing away, and the whole crew are attuning to him and attuning to his sound. And they're doing it with their lives on the line, because if, and listening is such an interesting thing, to move away from the more dense, like beeswax in the ears and the tied to the mast. We're definitely in phase 3 here of the process. Now we're able to be free. We're able to have our hands free and our ears free and our listening free. We're able to embrace the feeling function, and actually Orpheus himself is a symbol of that feeling function. And I would call him quite a Neptunian figure in his own right. Orpheus is like positive Neptune, where he takes us to, he's a storyteller and he takes us to these other worlds. He's like, his music is otherworldly. I think of music as a Neptunian or Piscean component. Maybe that's why Venus is exalted in Pisces. Like the real beauty of the music. And it's that beauty that also the sirens have, but there's something menacing about their music. There's something luring of their music. And so we're now not going to confront, we've sort of moved away from the Saturnian and into Neptune. We're going to confront Neptune with Neptune now. We've moved away from Saturn, where we're going to do things like block it out, avoid it, tie ourselves to the mask, have all these rules and Saturnian. Now we've moved, there's no rules there for anybody on of any of the Argonauts. There's no rules to follow. There's just the one thing that you got to do, and that is attune yourself to Orpheus's sound. So this is what I would call phase 3. You're completely open to the sounds of the sirens now. You're not trying to block them out. You're not trying to tie yourself up. You're open to them. But that sense has to be, you have to be in attunement with your soul. You have to be in attunement with your spirit. You have to know who you are. If you don't know who you are, then that sound is going to go through you, and it's going to take your attention. And then there you go. You'll be off the edge of the boat, down in the bottom of the ocean, down in your watery grave. What are we really looking at here? We're looking at Jung's concept of the shadow. The shadow, in Jung's terms, is not some dark, nasty thing. It's like the opposite of the I am. And any I am that we say creates an I am not. So for instance, if I am a thinker, then I am not a feeler. It creates the shadow of the feeling. I am smart might mean I am not sporty, so then sporty becomes the shadow, just to give a really basic example. So think about that, of like, the shadow is not necessarily some bad, evil thing that's lurking around. The shadow is the parts of the self that we disown. And then whenever we disown something, it becomes exiled. And whenever we exile something, it comes back in a monstrous form. But it's coming back in monstrous form so it can be integrated. Which is why when you're in phase 1, you can't really integrate that, because you have no relationship to it. In phase 2, where you're Odysseus tied to the mast, you can't really integrate that either, because you're really not creating any kind of relationship, and you're in the agony and the ecstasy, the throes of the pain around it. It's only in this phase 3 that we get the sense of being able to hear the sounds of the siren, and also being able to hear the sounds of the self. And what I would call phase 4 is being able to harmonize with the sirens. Now, once we can harmonize with the sirens, it's almost like just in that harmonizing, they become something else. It's like they're transformed. They're taken out of their monstrous form. And maybe they become a little bit more mermaid-like, a little bit more fun and playful, like water nymphs, basically. The nymphs of the ocean that are certainly not out to get anyone, not out to take anyone out. And then there's this kind of playful dance, and at that point you can just be around the sirens and not really be in any danger, because they've lost their shadow component. They've lost the projection of the shadow from you, and so therefore you're really allowed to be around it. So how do we apply this? My opinion personally is there's absolutely a place for like a very strict Saturnian approach, 12 steps, the beeswax in the ear, tying yourself to the mast. I think it's saved many lives. I think it's put people back on track. It's brought people back from the absolute brink of total destruction. Sirens in that form are totally destructive, right? They can completely destroy every component of your life, including your relationships and your relationship to family and friends. All sorts of ways that can dismantle and dismember your life. There's such obvious use for AA, and there's such an obvious place for AA. My sense of doing this podcast is to also open up, what is it that we're really reaching for? That was the Jungian question. What is it that we're really, truly reaching for? So what is the Dumbo's feather idea here? Can Dumbo just fly? Could he fly without the feather? At the end, he can fly without the feather. So he gets hooked on the grasping of this feather. The feather is what makes him think he can fly, but ultimately he can fly. He can let go of the feather and fly. For instance, I was talking with my trainer this morning who has been through addictive processes, has been an addict, and now he lives a very healthy life. He is my personal trainer, so he's very healthy, very fit, very well. We were talking about the process for him. And for him, there was like a nervous tension when it came to socializing. He had a really heavy bit of social anxiety in his system. And what the alcohol and other substances helped him to do was just like relax that. And so then it became like a superpower. He could have the alcohol or the other substances, and then he was able to be in the field and dissolve his inhibitions and all of those kinds of things. So then as he comes away from the addictive process, he has to put his beeswax in the ears and he's tied to the mast. He doesn't touch alcohol anymore. But he is working on that third phase as far as what he really wants is to be comfortable in his own soul and be able to be social and be able to move through the tension that he feels in social settings and social situations. So that's it when we move into that phase 3. Can we not touch the addictive thing, but have some kind of an understanding from the Orpheus perspective of what we're really looking to integrate back into ourselves? Like, for instance, confidence, or a self-confident place inside it, like a feeling that is worthy even, maybe underneath that is elements of feeling unworthy of love. And so you go towards all of these things because ultimately underneath you don't feel that worthiness. So how can we move into that place where we do feel worthy and where we do feel that we can be out in the world and move through our anxiety and move through that tension and actually interact and just be, more of that confident thing that the alcohol wasn't creating, it was just taking away these inhibitions. So in this sense, it's like, well, how can the inhibitions still drop away, but without the use of the alcohol? So again, rather than like, well, I'm never going to go out, that might be tied to the mast. I'm never going to get into those scenes because that's usually when I'll have the alcohol. We move, maybe that's a phase of the process, and then we move back into the world and we move back because maybe, there's something of the calling, there's something about who he's meant to be that is quite social. And the resistance is like the intensity of like how strong the calling is. So if he doesn't tune back into Orpheus and hear his own sound, then he can't get back into the world and he can't actually become his whole self. So there's kind of an example of how that would be. So, what we're talking about there is the sirens may be representative of that part of the unconscious that is needing integration. If we don't make any contact with it, if we have beeswax in the ears or tie ourselves to the mast, then we don't have the possibility of that deeper integration, that becoming whole, and that becoming who we really are. And it is a dangerous thing, right? I mean, becoming yourself is actually quite a dangerous thing. There's all sorts of treacherous things along the way. That's why we have, from time immemorial, we always have hero stories. We have stories of like heroic quests, which, as Joseph Campbell talked about so eloquently, is much more about becoming your whole self than it is about actually going out and getting a golden fleece. So yeah, as I said, astrologically, in the next few days, Saturn is going to be turning around from its position at 12 degrees of Pisces, and then it's going to start making its way and get closer and closer to Neptune. They're going to get very, very close to each other in the last degrees of Neptune. And we might be able to feel in our story of the sirens, the first two phases being very Saturnian and the second two phases being very Neptunian. And I wonder if there can be, like on a personal level, obviously on collective levels as well, but for us as we listen, really taking that in of like, where am I at in this process? Am I able to do those Saturnian things, like have healthy boundaries, have limits, know my limits, be able to state my limits, be walking through the world with that great integrity, and also having what Neptune offers to the world, which is to be in the flow, in the Tao, as it were, enjoy the experience and have really blissful, beautiful experiences in this life. Being able to access states of consciousness that are life affirming. I do think about Neptune as being related to the great god Dionysus, who is the one who will take us out into the forest and dance and revel. Obviously he's also the god of wine, so he is implicated in this process too. He was less about wine in the sense of that chemical process we have today, and more about some kind of honeyed ambrosia that would take us to an aphrodisiac kind of a state, aka, related to the goddess Aphrodite. Take us right into ourselves, right into the enjoyment of being alive. So what is happening is, as Saturn is going to get closer to Neptune, they're definitely in Neptune's home ground at the moment of Pisces. But when they actually meet, they're going to be much more in Saturn's flavor, in a way, of Aries. They're going to meet so they're going to they're going to have this process where they go in between, in a way. The Pisces, they're going to meet just near the very end and the beginning of the zodiac. And that's one of the great things that I'll be talking about 2025 when we look at what is happening. But this will give us like a mythic backdrop to that. We'll be able to see perhaps like ways that this myth shows up in the world. But I encourage you to take in that reflective process that I mentioned earlier, of like really taking it into your own soul, maybe doing some journaling or drawing. I have a client who's making these beautiful collages. She's gathering all of these images, and each collage is just becoming more and more deep, and she's really working through that water side of her, through the images and the symbols, and it's helping her water side, the feeling center, to really come alive. Because let's face it, as I've said before on this show, the feeling function in the world is denigrated. I mean, this is to me an element that I would call my version of what I would call patriarchy, not in the sense of like male dominating female, but in masculinity dominating femininity. And so I think there's a real call to bring back that sense of restoring the feminine ways of knowing. I've recently written an article for the Federation of Australian Astrologers journal that'll be coming out next month, which is all about the oracle and like restoring the place of the oracle, a real Neptunian, Piscean seer. And so how do we restore that inside of ourselves, our intuition, our creativity, our ability to drop in and to feel things, and even embodying knowledge, embodying knowing, and help ourselves out of the mind and of that deep inner critic and that one up there that can become so Saturnian and so rigid, without getting taken by the sirens over the edge of the boat and no longer being on track, and no longer kind of like standing up for, what we're meant to be doing in this life, and kind of like falling off track, right? I mean, that's always the danger in the Odyssey, that there's a confusion, and then it's just going round and round and looping and never actually making it back to Ithaca. So thank you for listening to the show. I hope it was enjoyable and that you got some nuggets of insight around the addiction and the addictive process. As we are in that 15 degrees of Scorpio, we're right in the heart of those processes right now. All sorts of feelings coming up in the collective, no doubt. All sorts of angsty feelings, and the agony and the ecstasy of being alive is coming through us now. How to be with all of those feelings, without numbing out or shutting off, or perhaps getting dragged into the ocean by the sirens. That's the question. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll be back next week. Next week, I actually have an interview with a man named Joe Landwehr. He reached out to me because he has a book out just now. It's called Astrology in the Era of Uncertainty, an Astro-Poetic Exploration of Psyche and Cosmos. It was a really great conversation. I really enjoyed it. He's been an astrologer for 50 years. He's a real elder, lives out in the forests around the trees, and I felt like I was talking to a holder of some kind of an ancient wisdom, like an old Chiron figure, and it was very enjoyable. And so I look forward to bringing that to you next week. Okay, see you next time. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.